Hi everyone, Helen Blunden here. Hope you're happy, healthy and well. It's time for a new book review today where I share some life lessons out of books that I have been reading, out of books that have come my way in the libraries, out of books that have come my way through secondhand bookstores and conversations with the proprietors, and out of books that have come my way through freaky coincidences of conversations with friends. The book that I'd like to talk about today is Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell, and it was written in 2004. I'm quite late to the piece with regards to reading this. I'm no stranger to that fact because I am quite late in reading a lot of books, but I'm glad I read this one. And this book came about through a conversation with a friend who I hadn't seen in the last few years. As the conversation started around the topic of books, she mentioned this one because she raved about it, she loved it, she thought it was one of the best books she had ever read. And usually when people say to me, it's the best book that I've ever read, I take it with a grain of salt, because books, well, I've often said here, you know, if we all loved the same books, the world would be a very boring place. Given that there were lots of little coincidences that had been happening in the last few months of 2024, and this book had often come up in conversations or in things that I'd been reading, and I thought to myself, the universe is trying to tell me something. Helen, it's time to read Cloud Atlas. And I'm so glad I did, because I'm actually thinking that it's the book's time and place is now for the world, I reckon. I know that sounds a bit woo-woo. I'm not going to give any spoilers as I usually do, simply because this book is way too deep and it's also too complex to be able to wrap it up in a short video. Believe it or not, it's a book that you'll have to read and make assumptions for yourself as to whether you love it or whether you hate it. And if you're someone who likes complexity in writing, if you're someone who likes puzzles in their writing, then you might like this book. I would classify this as not dystopian science fiction. I don't know. It's a very hard book to even put in a genre, because it's like reading 6 different books in one, but each of those books are not even complete. And if that's putting you off, just wait. And these stories are written in different genres and they're written in different formats of writing styles. One story is written as a diary, another story as a series of letters, another story as a crime piece or a thriller piece, another story as an interview recording. But at the same time, each of these stories take place at different time periods of the world. So these 6 different stories are all linked despite the genre, despite the format style, and despite the protagonist. But each of them are linked through one soul, a soul of a person that travels through each of those time periods, who are connected in some way by those artifacts of documents, the letters, the diaries. At some stage, those are simply too far gone, simply because artifacts and documents disappear over a sense of time, but what is replaced by them is myths, lore, stories, and so that morphs. Now picture a Russian doll. As you open a Russian doll, a smaller Russian doll comes out of it, to the point you get one little doll that is completely complete. You can't open her up. So what you do is then you put it back into the bigger doll and you have that. Now imagine that in a book. That's how this book is written. 6 different stories that you read, you get to the climax, and then bang, it stops at half sentence, and then you turn the page and bang, you're into a second book, a second story. Again, it takes you up to a climax, and then bang, it stops, and then it takes you into the third story, and so forth. Right up to the point where you get to the middle, where the middle is a complete story. And then once you can finish that story, you go back to the first story, and which goes into its completion. The second story gets into its completion, the third story into the completion. Really creative. As I was reading this book, I thought to myself, my God, there are some writers who are simply creative in their way of writing, and this was one of them. So if you're interested in how writers can create this very different writing style, then check this book out. If that is not of your preference, David Mitchell's writing style reminded me a lot, without the Russian doll effect, of the writing by Edward Rutherford, who you might know, who writes these massive tomes of books around countries and cities. And I've got all of Edward Rutherford's books because I'm a great fan. It's kind of like reading history in short snippets, although it's not short here, obviously, as you can see. Edward Rutherford is also a writer who writes different stories across different time periods of a city, and we get to see how a city grows over a period of time. And he's written books on Dublin, we've got books on London, Sarum, we've got Moscow, Paris, New York. So he's got tons of these books, and these are the stories that go through time. However, David Rutherford does not write in that very circular Russian doll effect. I mentioned before that it came at the right time and place. At a time late last year, I was thinking about a lot of things about my life, where I've come from, what I want to do next, why I'm doing these YouTube channels and so forth. Lo and behold, I still don't have the answers. Is the theme of a soul being reincarnated, and the soul gets reincarnated into different people through the different stories. Determining how that soul goes through life is really determined by the decision points at certain time periods of that person's life, where they could make a choice for good or they could make a choice for evil. At that crossing point, if they make a choice for good, the world becomes a better place over time. However, if they choose bad, the world becomes eaten up by corporate greed, by violence, and so forth. Ultimately, this book is telling us that we can all make certain choices in our life. No matter what we think and how small they are, anything we do has an impact for people going forward. However, when you read this book, it's not, these themes don't automatically hit you, and they aren't outwardly stated. It's something that you have to kind of read and then question, think about, and it was a book that I was consistently thinking about. It took me over a week to read this, a week of daily reading, of hours of reading, trying to understand it. But the stories themselves are quite immersive, but they don't tell you what those answers are until it gets wrapped up right at the end of the book on the last page, where you get to understand the importance of making choices in our life that do good by others, that are all about us being good, because what we do today will impact us tomorrow. So in the book, it talks about our past and our future and how it's linked. So if this is our present day, and we assume that on this timeline it's our past and on here it's our future. The book mentioned that there is an actual past and a virtual past, and he determines by actual being what really happened, what is written, what is documented, and we have these documents through testimonials that come through diaries, that come through letters. They are physical evidence of what actually happened to people. So let's call that our actual past. However, he also said there is a virtual past, and the virtual past is the narratives, the stories, the myths, the assumptions of what we thought happened based on the physical evidence that we have in our hands. Now, as we go through time, these physical documents disappear through time, and we see that nowadays. I mean, I do question sometimes that there is a whole heap of physical documentation in our libraries, hard copy books, hard copy reports. What's going to happen to all those? If they are slowly digitized over time, they could disappear. We don't know. Anyway, that's a topic for another day. So let's come to our present. At our present, what we decide if we come against an actual problem that we need to resolve, or something happens in our life and we have a choice to make, that choice, whatever we do, determines a path that we go on changes for the future. And so in the future, we have actual future, what really happens, which we don't know because we can't obviously see in the future. People in that time will be impacted by it because that'll be their actual time. We have the virtual future, which are our assumptions, prophecies, our make-believe, the possibilities. We don't know what's going to happen, right? The book is like a weird Russian doll effect, an atlas, if this was an orb of some sort that is rotating. Each story has some kind of artifact that comes from it, but over time, as it becomes the future, that is then recounted as lore and narratives and storytelling and myths and religion. It's no surprise that some of the stories you could see where the choices of good and bad were made because of the different civilizations that came out in the future. The two different civilizations were ones based on good, where civilizations were cooperative, collaborative, they worked together, and it was done for the good of the common people. The other civilization was one of tribalism and also one of a very dystopic future where it was all about the consumer and consumerism, and where people had lost that connectivity with each other and their humanity. Civilizations that had evolved to those point of tribalism, of corporatism, were the ones it gets covered in the first story around slavery and this idea of people back then believing that civilization had some kind of ladder, and at the top of the ladder were the Anglo-Saxon races, the second were the Latinos, going down the Asiatics, the Black, the American Indians, and right at the bottom, which was quite disheartening, was where they claimed the irreclaimable races, the Australian Aboriginals, and the ones who were doomed for extinction were the Guanches, the Canary Islanders, and the Tasmanians. And this type of thinking, reading about it, was actually quite awful. I had a reaction to this as well. And I thought to myself that what the author was saying here through the stories is that type of thinking is not all about us making a better world for the future. It is instead we're making a world that eats each other, that is predatory, and where selfishness leads us to extinction. And so that's the reason why I thought that at the end of 2024, I think there was a reason why I read this book. It's because a lot of the themes in this book are very relevant to what the world is going through today. This was a book that I had to read today to kind of make sense of the world, and also in some kind of my own quiet way realize that every choice that we make in our life, you do it for the good of yourself and for the people in general. Some of the other life lessons in this book is all about colonialism and the destruction of different human races and tribes by the whites. And this was set out initially right at the beginning in the first story, where we were introduced to the tribe of the Maori people, and they've long since died out. And they were a group of people who worked in their very harsh environment but worked together to be able to survive. And when you read about these stories, and also the stories, my own background obviously being in Australia, is the story of the Australian Aboriginals and how they also were a group of people who worked with each other and had their own stories and myths and laws. And you get to realise that why was one group, the whites, so destructive over the years, and what have we missed out by not learning about other groups of people who live differently from us. So that is all I have for Cloud Atlas. It was a genius book in the way that it was written and how the story unfolded. However, it was a difficult read, and if you're someone who enjoys, as I mentioned, complexity and problem solving, then I think you'll enjoy this book. Bear in mind, you can watch the movie, but I don't think watching the movie just once, you'll get it. There were a lot of things that the movie didn't have that was in this book. So this book is quite in-depth. So use it as a book where you can set aside some time. You can delve into each of the stories. You can sit and reflect with each of the stories. You can also use the opportunity to be like a puzzle and try and pick out certain phrases and how they link to previous stories. Just enjoy the book for what it provides and the thinking that it provides and how relevant it is to today's world. So thank you for listening and thank you for watching. Bye for now. Oh, by the way, for anyone who's read this, did you think that Papa Sang's corporation was McDonald's? A future McDonald's where they're using robots to serve the customers, which is actually what's happening today as you go and pin in your order, which I refuse to use those things because of the fingerprints and disgusting germs.